Do you have a special gift because you know what others are thinking and feeling without ever talking to them? And you can tell this just by observing others and the way they act. And you're sure that you're thinking very clearly and you understand. Think again. This is called mind reading, and it's just one of 5 cognitive distortions that I'm going to discuss in today's video. Hi, I'm Dr. Brian. Cognitive distortions are more than just mental mistakes. They're the lenses through which we often view the world, but they're blurry, inaccurate lenses. And today, I'm going to dissect 5 key distortions to see how they often play out in everyday scenarios, and I'm going to try and equip you with some strategies to challenge and change these faulty thinking patterns. The first pattern is all or nothing thinking. This is also known as black and white thinking. It's a cognitive distortion where we perceive situations, people, ourselves in extreme, absolute, and rigid terms. It's a very binary mode of thinking. It's a 1 or a 0, and it lacks complete nuance and ignores the normal spectrum of possibilities or the gray areas that exist in most situations in life. For example, someone on a diet might do very well for months or years, and one day they eat one unhealthy meal. Now, with black and white thinking, they think they've completely ruined their diet plan. And this might lead them to completely abandon the diet plan instead of recognizing this minor indiscretion is just a minor setback. Or another example of black and white thinking in the workplace is if you have a supervisor or a boss who doesn't achieve a perfect score on a work evaluation, then as that person, you might think you're a total failure. You ignore your areas of strength or improvement that might have been noted in the evaluation, but you concentrate and believe you failed. How do we solve this? Well, seek the gray area. It's all about recognizing that life, with its multiple experiences and outcomes, often exists in shades of gray rather than absolute terms of black and white. So, for example, when you catch yourself thinking in these rigid, defined extremes, pause, try and reframe the thought in a more nuanced term. And if you're thinking, I always mess things up, challenge this by considering instances where you've succeeded or partially succeeded. A more balanced thought process might include, sometimes I make mistakes, but there's also times when I do well. A second type of cognitive distortion is known as overgeneralization. This is where in your mind you see a single negative event as really a never-ending pattern of defeat for you. This type of thinking involves drawing broad, general conclusions based on very limited data, very specific instances, and it leads to tremendous pessimism and a real skewed view of reality. For example, you might fail at one task, a tiny part of a task, and now you think, I always fail, or I never succeed in anything. One example might be after a single romantic rejection. You think, I will always be alone. You ignore other successful relationships you've had in the past or potential future connections, and you base everything on this one event. In the workplace, negative feedback session again might lead to you as an employee, or if you're a boss, I'm bad at my job. Even if there are multiple instances where I've been praised and completed successful projects. Or a good example of overgeneralization is if you're trying a new hobby and you find it challenging, or you aren't able to figure it out, or you're not able to complete it, you might think, I'm not good at learning any new things. And you completely ignore and overlook past learning successes when you've learned other new hobbies or other new activities. What do you do with overgeneralization? Well, in this case, seek specific evidence to the contrary. Remember times when you were successful or when things really went well. For example, this hobby is really tough, but when I did other things, after time, I figured it out and I became really good at it. And again, you can reframe your language and your thoughts. You can be more precise. Instead of saying, I always fail, you say, I didn't succeed this time, but I have succeeded in multiple other different situations, so I can probably do it again. A third type of cognitive distortion is mental filtering. This happens when you filter out all the positive aspects of a situation and you focus solely on the negative. A small negative detail becomes your whole story. It again can create a tremendously skewed view of reality, give you pessimism, negativity as you look to doing things in the future. A good example of this is if you're in a relationship, a long-term relationship, as a partner, you might focus on just the occasional arguments that you have in this relationship, and you ignore the day after day and the many happy, loving moments that you have in this relationship. Or if you're a student, you might receive a really high grade on an exam, but you did make a few minor mistakes. But instead of appreciating that high grade, you dwell on these few minor errors, and that makes you feel like a failure, despite very clear overall success. So what are strategies to overcome this cognitive distortion of mental filtering? Well, you have to consciously recognize it, as with all of these, and then you have to deliberately identify and acknowledge the positive aspects of the situation. Even if they seem small or insignificant, you have to recognize them and try and balance your perspective. One really good method to help you with this is keep what's called a gratitude journal. When you come upon an event that you focus on and you cycle on that you feel is so negative, look at this situation and analyze it. Write down the positive things that you can find. For example, in the test example, you identify that you got 94% of the questions right, and when you looked at it, you actually really shined on the essay questions. This allows you to shift focus from the negative to the positive and get out of that cognitive distortion. How else do you challenge this? Well, when you notice yourself focusing solely on the negative, challenge these thoughts by asking, what out of this whole situation went well? Or what is another way to look at this situation? What would somebody else say about my test scores? The fourth cognitive distortion is mind reading. This involves making assumptions about what others are thinking without sufficient evidence. It is characterized by the belief that you can understand the thoughts and intentions of others, but without direct communication, just by observing them, just by seeing what they do. This distortion often leads to the assumption that others are thinking critically or negatively about you. And this, as you might imagine, can significantly affect your interpersonal relationships. For example, you might think a friend is bored or uninterested in your company because when you're with them, they're quiet and they don't seem to be paying attention. What you don't consider is they're tired or they're preoccupied with a significant problem, family issue of their own. At work, when you interact with your supervisor or one of your employees, they might have a very neutral expression. You interpret this as a disappointment in your work or disappointment in your supervisory capabilities, even if there's no direct communication to support this. Or another example of mind reading at home. You might assume a family member is really angry with you because you've texted them and they didn't respond to the text. But you completely overlook other things like they were busy, they didn't see it, their phone isn't working. So what are strategies to overcome mind reading? Well, what you really want to do is seek clarity. Instead of assuming, seek and ask for direct communication. If you're unsure about someone's thoughts or feelings, it's a lot more effective to talk with them and inquire rather than make a guess, especially when your guess always is negative. And you have to challenge your assumptions. Remind yourself that you really can't read minds. And although you kind of think your assumptions are true, they might not be accurate. And reflect on some of your past experiences and instances which showed you that your initial assumptions, especially the real negative ones, were really proven wrong. And you want to allow for multiple interpretations of someone's behavior. You have to recognize that people's actions can be influenced by a lot of factors, and a lot of them, even though you think you're really important, are completely unrelated to you. The fifth and final cognitive distortion is catastrophizing. This involves expecting the worst case scenario to happen. It's a cognitive distortion where you assume the worst will happen and bad consequences will be magnified beyond a reasonable level. And it usually involves two key processes. One is predicting very negative outcomes, and two, exaggerating the impact of these negative outcomes. It is really characterized by an expectation of disaster, And it often involves a series of what if questions where the answers progressively get worse. What if I run out of gas? What if I can't walk to the gas station? What if someone tries to hit me on the road? What if I go to the hospital? What if I lose my family? All those kind of things. So people who catastrophize tend to ruminate or think on the worst possible outcomes, even when such outcomes are highly unlikely. For example, you may wake up in the morning with a headache, and instead of thinking that, well, I didn't have enough coffee or I stayed out late, you suddenly jump to, I have a brain tumor. I'm going to die. I'm going to lose my family and my kids. An example in a personal relationship is that you have a small disagreement with your friend or your partner, and you see that as the end of the relationship. In a professional setting, you might get a minor critique from a supervisor, but you interpret this as a prelude to getting fired and ruining your career and becoming homeless. And commonly, if you're catastrophizing, this fear of disastrous outcomes can lead to what we call paralysis by analysis, because you go into complete inaction or avoidance, because you're too frightened to face potential challenges. So what are the strategies to overcome catastrophizing? Well, once again, you have to really identify that you're having this cognitive distortion and disordered thoughts. But you have to ask yourself, how likely really is the feared scenario? And what past evidence from yourself or others supports or refutes this? This will bring a more realistic perspective to the situation, and you can identify what are really more realistic outcomes, and you can look at finding alternatives. It's especially useful to employ friends or family to critique your thinking and keep you from thinking the sky is falling like Chicken Little. Thanks for watching. Try these other videos on rumination and catastrophizing, and please don't forget to hit subscribe.